Hello? Hi, everyone. We would like to invite everyone to take a seat because the program is about ready to start. Thank you very much.
Can you hear me? Could you please mute your cell phones or turn them off? I'm going to do that myself. Then throw your cell phone away. Eileen, can I start? Is Anita my sister? Hey, good. Okay. Hello, friends of Johan Hultin. My name's Peter Hultin, and I'm speaking for myself and my sisters, Vivica, Anita, and Ellen. We were the ones who called Johan Daddy and Dad. Our sister Vicky passed away last December. We're still in shock, and we miss her terribly as well. We all shared some of the same feelings and thoughts about our dad. Is the volume okay? Too loud? Sounds really loud to me. Okay, our childhood was definitely unique. First, our neighbors and friends were Americans and our parents were from Sweden, and Swedish language was often heard in the house. We were also the only family that didn't own a car for many years. We had huge, bright yellow SUVs. Big. Some were four-wheel drive. Yes, we grew up very different from other kids in Marin County, California. Our dad was a car safety innovator, and all of our vehicles were big SUVs painted bright yellow. They had big black water bumpers, reclining airplane seats, thick foam padding everywhere inside, racing seat belts, and some reflective tape on some In the 1960s, Johan and partner David Schmidt wrote a report to the government about car accelerator linkage worsening accidents and gave a solution for the design. That began a lifelong interest in auto safety, resulting in an award from Ralph Nader. Johan was probably one of the very first to put seat belts in a family vehicle in the United States. Very first people. And the first ones he installed were salvaged from an airplane because seat belts were not available for cars yet. And this was all because our dad loved us and was fearful of us being injured. Whenever we went anywhere with our mom, to the store or school or the library, we rode in a big, bright yellow International Harvester SUV with big mirrors on the front fenders, airplane seats, seat belts, thick padding, and water bumpers. This was a bit embarrassing for us kids. One day we pulled up to my junior high and a little girl asked, "Is this the school bus?" I was so embarrassed. But later in life, I realized Dad was the leading edge of citizen engineering for the people, and his efforts have certainly saved lives. We were the safest kids everywhere we drove. We siblings all agree, Ellen, Anita, where's Anita? There, and Vivica as well, all agreed that, what did we agree to? Let's see. Oh, we siblings agree that our upbringing was what made us who we are today. Our lives as children were filled with adventure, especially in good weather months in California. Anita says it was like one adventure after another, nonstop. Ellen says her interest in rescuing cats came directly from her parents' love of nature. On weekends, we often packed up the truck and headed to the mountains for a camping trip in a beautiful spot or to search for Donner Party Emigrant Trail evidence or gold country mining ruins or the tallest tree in the world in the deep redwood rainforest. We kids had no problem sleeping on the ground, and we often did. In those days, the days of the firefalls, we could drive into Yosemite Valley on a weekend and find a campsite. My sisters went to Europe with our parents, and I got to go to the Galapagos Islands when it was still very primitive. At age 14, and very primitive, there was no airport and no hotel on the islands. At age 14, I rode on a giant tortoise, saw blue-footed boobies, laid down on a beach next to a sea lion pup and its mother who ignored me, and watched seagoing iguanas spitting salt on volcanic rocks. Back on the Ecuadorian mainland, we took public buses into the Andes, riding dangerously close to the cliffs and down into the Amazon jungle. I rode in a dugout canoe on the Rio Napo, an Amazon tributary, at the very end of the jungle road. Let me read a little thing I wrote here about one of our adventures, the Donner Party thing. Quote, one summer day in the 1960s, my Swedish immigrant parents told us 4 kids to remain in our 1963 Chevy SUV truck at the edge of the Utah salt flats until they returned. They put on backpacks, picked up shovels and a military surplus mine detector, and walked out into the salt desert. My dad had figured out where to start walking by using triangulation from a picture in a history book. We watched as they disappeared into a mirage 30 minutes later. We'd been following the Donner Party Trail and other immigrant wagon trail routes for several summers. My dad learned that some souvenir hunters had taken pieces of the Donner Party wagons that remained on the flats where they had been abandoned in sticky mud in 1846. He decided to retrieve pieces for the Donner Museum at Donner Lake in order to save them for future generations. About an hour after my parents disappeared in the mirage, a rain dust storm blew in and we saw lightning and heard thunder. The storm cleared out and several hours later, they reappeared and slowly made it back to the truck. They told us later that lightning struck 75 yards away as they laid as flat as possible in the perfectly flat, muddy landscape with a mine detector standing up as a lightning rod some distance away. They laid down far away from each other so they would not both be killed by a lightning strike. Okay, the wagon wheel pieces they found, they donated to the museum and they were put on display. Now, we kids were never in danger. We were the safest kids everywhere we went, remember? Okay, our dad did big things. And after the big war, he hitchhiked from Sweden to Egypt and climbed the Great Pyramid. He climbed famous mountains, found the 1918 flu virus in Alaskan permafrost, caused big advances in auto safety, and built an amazing mountain house of old growth redwood, much of it with his own hands. But as we remember those things today, we siblings all remember the personal things, like the fact Johan was a generous and kind man and he loved nature. The love of nature and seeing beauty in nature came to all of us from our parents. We siblings all have part of our dad in us. We all love nature and life, all life. Our dad set the example when we were really small. Any insect or spider in the house was not killed, but was trapped and let outside. Similar treatment was given to worms on the driveway after a rain. Johan picked them all up and placed them safely back on the soil, probably while talking to them. We all do this today. A couple of days ago, I apologized to a daddy long-legged spider that I accidentally injured mortally in the bathroom. I told the spider it wasn't intentional. Our favorite place in the high mountains we called our lake. It's a number of small snow-fed ponds in the prettiest place you can imagine, with huge granite slabs and boulders, fir and pine trees in forested patches in between, natural bonsai trees between the boulders, and delicate shrubs like gooseberry and heather. We hiked around the area, swam in the lakes, tried to fish, listened to the wind in the trees, saw meteors, told stories, and sat around campfires talking. At dusk, when the evening breeze stopped and stillness came over the forest, we heard the birds tweeting and squawking on their way home. We felt the dew on our sleeping bags in the morning as the sun warmed up the day. And our dad always cautioned us to be careful of the plants around the campsite and how those plants need our protection because they already live in a perilous life in nature. So as kids, we learned to protect the environment that we fell in love with. And to this day, we are careful when we walk in nature, never trampling delicate plants, but instead seeing their beauty and probably talking to them. Our dad never panicked and rarely swore. I do not remember ever being spanked. For many years, he hid his feeling, but his wife, Eileen, helped bring him out. Anita wrote the following quote, "I miss my dad terribly. And despite my glowing and unforgettable childhood, what I miss the most is the recent anticipation I felt while driving to Rossmoor to visit him. When I arrived, he always threw the door open and chuckled loudly. Guess what? I'm still here. I got out of bed today. I'm not in the cemetery yet." We would hug and then enjoy the day together. I cherish those memories and always be thrilled when he walked me out to my car, both of us waving furiously as they drove off. The adorable vision of dad holding his prized Archie in his arms and becoming a smaller and smaller speck as I watched him in the rearview mirror. When he could no longer see me, I usually pulled over and cried, wondering if this was our last time. Soon he couldn't walk me to the car anymore. My father was bigger than life. This is still Anita. My father was bigger than life, often making me feel I would explode with pride. I can't imagine a world without him. When my dad entered any room, he brought the sun with him and lit up even every dark corner. Everyone took notice. He broke the mold. Here's my favorite vision of my dad and Eileen. Both of them are relaxing on the couch. My dad is talking to Archie in that voice that nobody ever dreamed we'd hear, a baby voice. You see, our dad was always stiff and serious, kicking at dogs, saying, "Goddamn dogs." Eileen's magic somehow softened his edges, and that allowed him to be filled with the deep and complete love for his sweet, white, curly little Havanese doggie named Archie. Thank you, Eileen. What you gave to him in that transformation set him free. None of the siblings ever thought our father would love a dog, but Archie was deeply cherished, almost as much as all of his siblings. No, not really. The ones he named his little pieces of protoplasm. End quote. We want to thank Eileen for hosting this lovely event. Eileen, hosting this lovely event in this beautiful place, but mostly for being a great companion for our dad, an intellectual peer he could speak freely with and share ideas, and for helping bring out the softer side he kept hidden. You certainly changed the man and helped him to be his own true self. Thanks also for being there to protect him in his more fragile years. Thanks everyone for coming today.
On behalf of my mother, thank you all for being here today to celebrate our sweet Johan. I imagine he's looking around the room right now and saying, now this is fantastic. My sisters and I feel so lucky that Johan was a part of our family for the last 40 years. He came into our lives when we were in a family in need of healing. There had been quite a bit of heartache, especially for our mother, Eileen. But Johan turned up in his yellow Volkswagen Rabbit and his charming ways and his Swedish accent. And I think we all fell a little bit in love with him. The day Johan and our mother were married, the minister bestowed a blessing upon them, which was, may you find happiness in making one another happy, and may you find love in loving one another. Johan and my mother most certainly did that. Johan taught us to think more deeply about things. He would sit across the table during a discussion and say, now why do you think that? Tell me more about that. It was a challenge to be more thoughtful and a little bit more inventive, and it always made me want to try a little bit harder. And Johan made us laugh. I remember very well driving to Marin General Hospital on the day that Matthew was born. He wanted to talk about mad cow disease. Rather than allow me to worry too much about the cesarean procedure that I was driving towards, he made sure I was giggling instead. His absurd questions about the clinical characteristics of mad cow disease were certainly a distraction. I also remember the day I took him for a ride in my brand new Toyota Celica convertible. At one point, he turned to me and said, now this is fun. Can you imagine the king of car safety? But he was being kind. He knew how happy I was that day, and he didn't want to take that away from me. Thank you, Johan, for telling us every day how beautiful our mother is. Yeah. For always seeing the bright side of every situation, for fish oil, for reminding us that the scary black spider in the corner of the room is actually Mary or her sister Lisa, just paying us a visit. Thank you for letting our children tie your shoelaces together when they were small, for teaching them Swedish drinking songs and replacing aquavit with milk, for always telling us the truth, for your ability to listen to everyone's story with keen interest, for helping all of us to expand our minds and keep learning. And thank you for making us believe that we are special and that we can do anything we want to do. I will finish with the words our then 6-year-old son, Daniel, wrote to Johan on his 80th birthday. What I like best about you, Grandpa, is that you know a lot of things and that you climb mountains. I think that we all loved that you climbed mountains. We will miss you.
Good afternoon. I met Eileen and Johan in Turkey many years ago, and after getting on a tourist bus, Eileen and I decided that we may have grown up in the same country. And then it turned out that I'd worked about 10 miles down the road from where she grew up. So she has kindly invited me to say a few words about Johan, who was on this trip to Turkey, but the rest of us were doing what everybody in Turkey does, looking for interesting monuments and things like that. And Johan was in search of the original wheat. He wanted to find the wheat that existed before it had been messed around with by all the people making bread in this country. Anyhow, I put together a little limerick, and I promise Eileen I will keep it clean. And in case there are any scholars in the room, it doesn't follow the exact rules for limericks, but I hope you'll forgive me. So anyhow, there was a young man from Sweden who thought California was the Garden of Eden. There was only one thing about which to grouse. It didn't have a Norwegian loft house. He decided to build one, but where? Johan chose the Valley of the Bear. And every piece he made by hand, and long may his monument stand. Much, sorry, you're gonna have to put up a little bit more. Much later, he met Eileen. He thought she sounded like the Queen. They met on a blind date, and she was not quite sure of her fate. His car was a little strange, she felt. It had every kind of seatbelt. It had extra padding everywhere and a crash helmet to spoil her hair. Much later, he did take Eileen rowing on a lake. And there on bended knee, he said, "Will you marry me?" But Eileen replied, "Eek!" The boat had sprung a leak. She said, "Stop your wailing and get busy bailing." Now, when it came to the Spanish flu, Johan found the clue in frozen DNA in a village far away. He outdid all his peers using Eileen's pruning shears. And so he found the fame that will be ever linked with his name. Thank you for the honor of listening to me.
My name is Mike Apicella, and I'm a colleague of Johan. I was chairman of the Department of Microbiology at the University of Iowa. And that's the institution that Johan attended in the 50s. First, I want to thank Eileen for giving me the honor to say anything at this meeting. I feel really humbled. I had a very inauspicious beginning of my meeting with Johan. I received a letter one day that was written, looked like it was torn out of a kid's notebook. And in this handwriting was someone who said they wanted to go to Alaska and dig up Eskimo bodies and wanted to know if anybody in our department worked on influenza. And I got a lot of a lot of letters like that from people who had all kinds of great ideas, and I generally didn't pay much attention to them. And I put this letter away, and my lovely secretary, who was invaluable, every week would bother me. Are you going to respond to that letter? I will. Evidently, I waited about 3 months before I responded. He had come back from Brevard already. And I'm sitting in my office in November 1997, and I get a call from the dean's office. And I go down, and the dean, who is a very stern gentleman, says to me, "You upset someone in San Francisco, and you better make nice pretty quickly." I found out a little bit about Johan, and I called. We arranged a visit for Johan and Eileen to come to Iowa City. And my first meeting with Johan, the thing I remember most striking, and I think my wife Agnes feels the same way, his hand. It was like gripping the hand of a blacksmith. And this continued until a couple of years before he passed away, the last time I saw him. It was amazing. And then, as everyone said already about the amazing things of this man's life and his many, many accomplishments, just incredible. He was truly the Swedish Indiana Jones. He was amazing. Let me give you a little background about his graduate work and the significance of what he did in Brevard later on and where it's brought us today. First of all, he was an older graduate student. He was 25 at the time he entered graduate school. In those days, the average age of a graduate student was 21. The chairman of the department at the time was a gentleman who was a phenomenal microbiologist named Roger Porter. And he assigned, in those days, they assigned the students to work with people. Johan had said he was interested in influenza, and they assigned him to work with a Dr. McKee. And McKee was a little bit older than Johan. He passed away only about 4 or 5 years ago. In fact, Johan talked at his memorial in Iowa City. They received $10,000 from the university to take a trip up to Alaska to undertake this project to isolate the 1919 flu virus. That's a virus that killed somewhere between 50 and 70 million people, okay? And it killed people in an unusual age span, generally from about 7 or 8 to 50s and 60s. For some reason, it spared the very young and the very old. He went out to Brevik, and they dug in the ice, found the body of a young girl and isolated some tissue, which they brought back to Iowa City. And typical of Johan, they didn't have dry ice. So what do? You take the fire extinguisher off the plane and use that to keep spraying the CO2 into the vials containing the tissue so it stays frozen. He gets to Iowa City and spends about 1.5 to 2 years working on trying to isolate the virus. Parenthetically, it's a good thing he didn't, because this was a virus that could have killed him. The one thing he knew was after this was done, the virus was dead. And unfortunately in science, one of the things we don't do is ever publish negative results. This was an incredibly important negative result that people should have known about. And Dr. Porter, he now had a 27-year-old graduate student, said the time has come for you to go back to medical school. He published a paper on the hemagglutinin of the influenza virus. And he went to the medical school at Iowa. And he's always told me the many times I met with him that that was his rebirth. He was born again. He finished medical school, went to the Mayo Clinic, and eventually came to California, set up a clinical practice. And the rest, basically, we all know about the wonderful things he did. The amazing thing in his life, he told me that he had 3 partners, and the way they worked their practice, one partner was always off for 4 months so they could do things that really interested them. And that's why he could achieve so much in his life. More of us should do that. He retires and he reads about, he still has his interest in the virus. This is now 46 years later. Reads about PCR and reads about this investigator at Walter Reed at the time, who's trying to isolate the virus from paraffin sections from soldiers. It's having very little luck. And after his ill-fated letter to me, he contacted Jeffrey Tauenberger at the Walter Reed Institute of Pathology. And Jeffrey says, we'll write a grant and get you money to go up to Alaska. And Johan says, the hell with that. I'll take $3,500 out of my bank account and I'll pay for it myself. And I don't have to go through all of the rigmarole that the NIH requires. I should also say that at this time, NIH sponsored an expedition to Spitsbergen Island to isolate the virus, spend $1 million. And they wore spacesuits and they were all, dressed up. Johan knew the virus was dead. He could go up, got permission from the tribal elders, went back to the same cemetery in Brevik and dug up the body that he eventually labeled Lucy, isolated the tissue from her, and then, typical of Johan, after he finished his work in Brevik, he built 2 crosses in the cemetery and had brass plaques with all the victims, 80 of them or 75 of them, on the plaques. That virus devastated these Eskimo communities. What does this all mean? The work he gave the tissue to eventually brought it back to Jeffrey at Walter Reed. Took Jeffrey 7 years to isolate the material, the first gene ever isolated from that virus. That led to the eventual exposition of the remaining genes. And they eventually got the whole genome and showed that this virus was super virulent in animal models. This has given us a tremendous insight into the pathogenicity of these viruses. And in fact, with COVID today, a lot of the work that was done on that tissue with Jeffrey really helped us develop the vaccine that many of us in this room have gotten. Wouldn't have happened anywhere near as fast and been anywhere near as good, except for the work that Johan did. This is truly an amazing achievement. I want to finish up. One of my happiest days, and I think my wife Agnes feels the same way. Johan received an honorary doctorate from the University of Iowa in 2009. And just to know about the process of this, they have 10 senior faculty in a room. They have about 35 applications for this honor. And 10 faculty generally can't agree whether the sun rises in the east. Okay? It was a unanimous decision. Literally, it took 15 minutes for that to be done. It was amazing. More important was that Johan's face on that stage when they gave him that degree. And Johan's face when the medical students came up to him and congratulated him. It was just amazing, an amazing experience. So I had a wonderful experience in the 27 years that I knew him, though I had a very poor start on it. I know if I ever make it up to the pearly gates, I'm going to hear that voice say, Mike, we got to go on an adventure.
Eileen, what a great event. Isn't this fun? I love it. To Eileen, to the children, Vivica, Peter, where'd you go? There he is. And I want to include Anita, Ellen, Ann, Karen, Deborah, the grandkids, the relatives and friends in Sweden who are teleported here by the miracle of technology today and are joining us across the ocean. And friends here in the Tahoe Room. I am Richard McNeely, and I offer you greetings, and you got to help me with this. I'm going to try this in Swedish. To our friends in Sweden, hallå. May find out how I did later, right? I am honored and proud to stand here before you today and speak about our great friend, Johan. For those of you who knew him, I hope to kindle a warm remembrance. And for those of you who did not know him, I hope to introduce you to one extraordinary man. If there's a theme for the day, let it be this. While we are saddened by our selfish regret that we cannot go to Horseman's Canyon and enjoy Johan's company, let us not say in grief that we're sorry he's gone, but rather say in thankfulness and joy that he was here. Now, some might say that it was an unlikely friendship, me, a priest, and Johan, not entirely the fan of organized religion. But I dare say that everyone in this room who ever met him, and everyone joining us around the world who knew him, will say, I love Johan Hultin. That was one of the remarkable things about his life. Wherever he went, people loved him. And each remarkable turn in his life, at every one of those pivot points, Johan met somebody who became his friend and opened a door for him. Now, I said a moment ago, I love Johan Hultin, and I choose my words carefully. You see, love is a gift that's unique to our species. Now, my wife will argue with me that dogs are involved in this, but that's... Love is not something that expires when we leave this world. So our love of Johan and his did not leave us on January 22nd, because it will never cease. Our love is immortal. So we can say we love Johan Hultin and not say that we loved Johan Hultin. Now, I leave it to others to try to describe Johan's remarkable life. He lived and accomplished things that other men would need several lifetimes to accomplish. Now, you can read about it. You can read about those accomplishments in the biography by Gunilla Kuhlman. You can read about those things in Sports Illustrated. You can read about what he did in Time magazine. You can read about several professional journals that describe his work with the Spanish flu virus. But anyone, and this is literally true, any of us that have had the vaccine has a little piece of Johan in your arm. And anyone who's ridden in a car has some of Johan surrounding and protecting you. Now, it's no exaggeration to say that Johan was a physician specializing in pathology, earning high degrees and honors, and that he was a certified welder, a researcher, an engineer. He was a licensed commercial truck driver. He was a record-setting mountaineer. He was a home builder and a licensed general contractor. He was a woodworker and a carver. He was an inventor. He was a skier. He was a businessman. He was an adventurer. He was a thinker and a lot of other things too. If I may retreat from my clergy collar for just a moment, it's also not an exaggeration to say that Johan was one of God's better efforts. He was extraordinary. Now, from the list I just gave you, an aspect of Johan sort of jumps out at you. He was both a talented scientist with medical degrees and honors from top universities, both here and in Sweden. But he was as comfortable laboring with his hands, and a clue to this multi-dimensional man. He could speak with you in scientific terms about the mysteries of the human body and turn around and build a solid house with his bare hands. He could dig ditches for the foundation with his shovel and then engineer an automobile bumper that absorbed collision forces that saved hundreds of lives. But then he would turn around and build it into his beloved yellow car. He was as comfortable with scientists delivering papers to the brightest minds in medicine as he was sharing lunch at the Sorensen Resort with the many hired to build it. Even in his advanced age, and we've talked about this, but this is very true. Even in his advanced age, when Johan shook your hand, he offered a firm grip, but it was just a hint to the physical and personal strength of the man. He looked you in the eye, honest, sincere blue eyes that kind of twinkled with fun and had this mischievous spirit that I'll try to talk about in a minute. Johan was curious about almost everything. The internet was something that I decided was invented for Johan. He would spend hours in his study that's lined with books, research, history, medicine, botany, art, you name it. But if the books didn't do the job, he was as comfortable on the internet. And he would quench his broad and deep curiosity, researching, learning, and thinking. Johan began to tell me about his research into the origin of disease. And we talked for hours, and he reasoned that disease was uncommon among early man, among cavemen, and that our ancestors must have done something to bring disease into our lives. Now, here is a pathologist burning with curiosity. He had to know why. And he researched it. And after a time, he concluded that inflammation was the doorway to disease. And he began to think about the causes of inflammation. And he centered on nutrition and diet. And he reasoned that that had to be the variable. That was the factor that first opened mankind to disease. Now, anyone else would pat themselves on the back and say, you know, I've solved it. That's great. Not Johan. He studied it, and his curiosity didn't end there. he asked himself, why did one culture have lower disease rates than another? And he centered on the Polynesians, at least one of the times I talked to him about it, and so he began to work on coconut oil because that was endemic to the Polynesians, and that had to be an answer. But he began to question the role of wheat. And you've heard the story about him going to Turkey. But he decided that maybe it was wheat that was the food that was introduced into our ancestral diet that exposed us to inflammation. Now, once he reached that hypothesis, he had to do something about it. And he'd been retired for many years, but he kept current in medicine, and he knew that he could track the DNA of wheat and trace the lineage of the plant back to the first wheat plant. Now, he thought that if he could find that first plant, he might learn more about the mechanism of inflammation and first exposure of mankind to disease. Now, I'm a lawyer. I can't explain anything about DNA or how he did it, but Johan did. And if you've heard, the wheat plant was in Turkey. But that wasn't enough for Johan. He was a man of action. He had to go there and find the wheat plant that he called mother wheat, the plant from which all wheat was descended, and he needed a sample to examine and study. Now, thus was born the engaging story of Johan, the international spy, a man of intrigue. Now, if you don't know that story and you'd like to hear it, look me up later or ask any of the family. They can tell you probably better than I can. As you've seen, Johan was not one to preach and not live out his words. He studied nutrition, ran up against the problem of how to test his theories. And he couldn't ask his friends to accept the experimental diet and the frequent blood testing, although I think if he'd asked, we all would have said sure. So he developed a means by which he could test the ideas about nutrition on himself. He was his own laboratory and his own lab mouse. He found a lab that would accept blood samples that he had collected from his own body. And he experimented on himself with various changes in diet. Now, one such experiment involved the product of fermentation of various vegetables. And he would culture the vegetables and then eat the results. He would wait a while, take a blood sample from his arm, give it to the lab, get the blood test back, and then make his conclusions based upon how his own body reacted to what he had been eating. Now, Eileen, as you all know, is an elegant woman. She is completely and deeply in love with Johan, and she tolerated his experiments to a point. Now, one of the byproducts of Johan's fermentation experiments was a peculiar aroma, which most people find offensive. Now, my wife Belinda and I were enjoying dinner at Horseman's Canyon one evening when Johan enthusiastically described to me the benefits shown by his latest experiment. And I made the social faux pas of asking about the experiment. Now, whereupon Johan took me to the kitchen and he opened a door that looked to me like a large kitchen cabinet, but instead it was a refrigerator. And in the refrigerator, he took out this jar, mason jar, and in it was this black greenish goo. And when he opened the lid, the pungent odor of his ongoing experiment instantly filled the kitchen. Now, Eileen was visibly and audibly upset about that. Johan had interrupted a lovely dinner evening and her guests with this odor of his experiment. Now, there was this awkward moment when I struggled with how to calm the situation, but I needn't have bothered. I want to speak now confidentially to the husbands and future husbands among us. Listen to how a good husband dealt with the problem and learn. Johan leaned toward Eileen, and with his hands clasped at his chest and with puppy dog eyes, he said, "Eileen, I love you." And the moment passed, and the guests of the evening were restored. Can you begin to get a picture of the innate charm of this man? Now, I first met Johan in connection with his receipt of a medical award in Sweden, and I learned of his work with the Spanish flu that you've heard about, and his trips to Alaska. And when next I saw him, I was dying to learn more about it. Now, Johan was modest and humble about all his accomplishments, and he was very dismissive about all the things that he accomplished in his life. And it was only after my repeated questioning over several months, and I practiced law for 43 years in trial, trying to get the information out of him like I did a witness on the stand. And finally, I got what I think to be almost the whole story. And I had to pull and extract it, but I'll leave the details of that for others. I want to focus on, for a second, on how Johan was given the authorization to dig up the bodies of the ancestors of the Alaskan Inuit people high up in Alaska's frozen tundra that you've heard something about. The ground covering the remains of their ancestors was for them, as it should be for us, sacred ground. And there had to be a meeting of the tribal council to give Johan permission to disturb the graves of their ancestors. And the discussion wasn't going Johan's way. But the chief stopped the proceedings and spoke. And she reminded them that Johan had been there 20 years before and that he'd been respectful of their dead. And he was a man that you could trust. Council gave him permission to open the mass graves. Johan's honesty and his charm allowed him to make the discovery that would unlock the secrets of the deadly virus. One other story to illustrate that same point. When Johan was a young man and the war in Europe had just ended, young Johan decided he wanted to see the pyramids of Egypt. You've heard part of this story. And with a knapsack on his back and a college cap, he set off to hitchhike from Stockholm across devastated Europe all the way to Egypt. Now, here was this Hollywood, good-looking, tall, fit, blonde-haired, blue-eyed young Swede standing by the roadside wearing his college cap. Would you be surprised to learn that he never had a problem getting a ride? And he made it to Giza. Where'd we go? There we go. And from Giza, he hitchhiked to Istanbul. I'm sorry, my pages got confused here. Now, as he was walking across Europe, it was still devastated from the war. And he walked into a city in Germany that was still smoldering. And he encountered a policeman. And he was taken into custody, I assume as a vagrant. But on the way to what was left of the jail, Johan's charm saved the day. Instead of jail, the policeman took him to his home and what was left of a bombed out basement, where Johan spent the next 3 weeks with this new friend and foster uncle. Now, there's another aspect of Johan that you should know about. He was stubbornly independent, but in a good way. Where most men would think, gee, that ought to be done, Johan thought, I will do it. So when Johan purchased a Norwegian home that had been disassembled and put on a ship and shipped across and landed in Alameda, he faced the problem of how to get it from Alameda up to Hope Valley, where the Sorensen Nordic ski resort was that he was building. Now, anybody else would do what? Hire a truck, right? You get a hold of a trucking company and you pay them some money and they'll put it up there and they'll take it up there for you. Not Johan. He studied and he got a license as a commercial truck driver. So he rented the truck, put the house on it, and drove it all the way up to Tahoe and unloaded it to build the Sorensen ski resort. Now, when it was time for Johan to begin the construction of this idyllic Nordic house that he built in Bear Valley, he decided he wanted to build it out of old redwood, and he even selected the trees that he wanted. Now, anybody else would have logging truck, etc. Nah. Johan did that too. So these trees are sitting around on the lot, and they're huge. They're 20 to 15 feet in diameter. And he's got to figure out a way to cut them up to mill it. So anybody else would have hired the lumber mill and they would have cut it up for him. Not Johan. He developed and built his own mill, portable mill, and he milled those trees himself. So when he needed something to build the house, he just cut it out of the trees and worked it that way. Now, I want to tell you about Johan, the prankster, and the fun that he was. So I want to tell you a couple stories. He was a young medical student in Uppsala University, getting toward the end of his degree, and there's this annual celebratory dinner every year. And Johan turned out to be the producer of this event. And he decided it really needed lightening up. So he developed a way so that when the red beet salad was served at the tables, with a push of a button that he designed, you got it, the salad erupted to the ceiling and rained over everybody in this thing. And some people say that had something to do with his departure from Uppsala University to Ohio University, but that's just a story. And one last story about his pranks. It's time for Johan to attend an engagement dinner. And he is resplendent in his formal wear. But as he entered the room, attached to his foot is a ball and chain. And Eileen married him anyway. Where did that go? It was fun to be Johan's friend. He was humble, he was modest, interesting, intriguing. And weren't we all blessed to have known him? I'd like to leave you with a lyric of a song that I found that seems fitting for this occasion. And it goes like this. When at last my end shall come, the end of song and rhyme, please remember this of me. I had a lovely time. I frolicked over many lands and over many seas, and everywhere found light and cheer and health and joy and ease. The hearts and hands of many friends have clasped mine as we passed, and I in turn have loved them well and will until the last. So remember me as I go to wherever scene or clime, that in this world I sadly leave. I had a lovely time. That in this world I sadly leave. I had a lovely time. The family has asked that I close this little talk with a prayer. So with your indulgence, let us pray. O God, whose mercies cannot be numbered, accept our prayer on behalf of the soul of thy servant, Johan, and grant him an entrance into the land of light and joy in the fellowship of the saints. O Father of all mercies and giver of all comfort, deal graciously, we pray thee, with all of us who mourn, that casting every care on thee, we may know the consolation of thy love. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Thank you.
Johan Hultin taught us that every mountaintop can be reached if we just keep on climbing. He knew from a lifetime of experience that the best views come after the hardest climbs. Johan's limitless enthusiasm for life led him and his family to countless keen insights and to wonderful adventures.
What Johan taught me to pass on to our two boys is to seize the day, just go for it. Whatever it is that is your dream, whatever you care about, seize it.
He taught us all the absolute beauty. And he would sometimes he'd say, let's sit here for a second and just listen. Just listen to the world where we are right now.
Although, of course, he loved lots of adventure and lots of activity, he also was 1000% excited to just sit across from you and talk.
Very charismatic. My father was a wonderful man. And my father was also very brilliant.
I would hear him out here on the deck talking to someone, and I knew there was no one here, and I'd come out and say, who are you talking to? And he would say, I'm talking to Mary. Mary would be a sparrow sitting on the fence.
In today's News 10 Close-Up, meet a Northern California pathologist who made it his lifelong mission to uncover the mysteries of the 1918 flu.
100 million people died in a year. Nothing like that has ever happened.
I think it showed that perseverance and never give up. I mean, he had gone initially when he was a young medical student in his 20s, had dug in the same place and the mission had failed. And he just sort of never forgot. He had to complete that. He knew that that pandemic came back, it could kill millions and millions of people.
So at the age of 72, he set off again.
I just couldn't wait to get up to Alaska and find it and bring it back.
With the help of some Eskimo boys, he began to dig once again in the permafrost.
This looks very good.
The most profound thing that we could all say about our dad is our upbringing when we were children, because we had such an unusual life. And it was it seemed like, looking back, it seemed like one adventure after another.
They believed in raising us with benign neglect. It was help us grow and help us be independent. I think he was raised that way in some ways too.
Johan grew up in a wealthy family in Sweden. Like other Swedish children, Johan learned to ski almost as soon as he could walk. Johan built a ski resort in the Sierras, climbed a mountain on skis in China, and skied every winter of his life until the age of 92. When he was just 17, Johan built a small summer cabin on a family-owned island in the Baltic. He had no previous building experience and did all the work by himself. Johan transported his tools and materials from the mainland in a rowboat.
He had to row with the building materials across this big ocean to get there. He did that day after school, and then his grades changed, and his whole life changed.
His father never went and saw it, never advised him, he just let him do it, never try to get in the way of what he had to figure out himself, and he did.
Johan's most ambitious building adventure was creating a meticulous copy of a 14th century Norwegian house. He built it in the Sierras at Bear Valley, California. Johan called it the cabin and said it would stand for 800 years. He did the work himself, and the family pitched in. In typical Johan fashion, he studied with a master woodcarver so he could create the cabin's many intricate traditional Scandinavian wood carvings.
The cabin's history started when he was a very young boy in Sweden, and he saw this one particular cabin which had come from the Telemark Valley in Norway, fell in love with it, and decided one day he would build a copy of this. And of course, being Johan, he didn't forget. And eventually he did build his cabin, and he started with 10 redwood trees.
I was there when they brought the logs up. 5 logging trucks, which are huge. Each one of them had one log on it because they were so big. And I think the biggest log was about 6 feet thick.
Johan learned to do the construction, learned carving, plumbing, electrical, and everything.
Right? Tiles.
Tiles, yes, but I did a lot of the tiles.
Oh, there you go.
So I don't give him a lot of credit for the tile setting. I was more efficient than he was.
In building this cabin, he definitely included the entire family. And because it went over so many years, you know, we were even bringing grandchildren on board to the work of building the.
Took 40 years to build it, and it's quite beautiful. He was very proud of it, but he really wasn't interested in actually living in the cabin. What he was interested in was building it.
It was always an adventure filled with laughter and fun. And we all can say that we have our sweat in Johan's cabin.
Yeah, there's a picture of me in a forklift. Which
Yeah.
is kind of crazy. I had the forklift too. I was in the forklift. Yeah.
Johan was fascinated by labyrinths, the mysterious ancient stone circles found on Baltic islands and in many places across the globe.
I think it was when he was a child in Sweden, and they had these stone labyrinths on the little islands in the Baltic, and he and his friends would play on them. And then as the years went by, we were living on Nob Hill across from Grace Cathedral. And they had this beautiful labyrinth, which they built on the outside. And he became very intrigued with this labyrinth and started to study labyrinths. And being Johan, anything that he studied in Dev.
With Eileen's direction and help from the world's authority on labyrinths, they braved bitter weather to restore a centuries-old labyrinth in Iceland.
And we restored the labyrinth in the most unbelievably horrible weather you can imagine, with the rain coming down horizontally. But we did restore the labyrinth.
And Johan and the family built their own labyrinth at the cabin in Bear Valley. Johan's interests were as varied as his curiosity was endless. He pioneered safety equipment for automobiles. Virtually every car, truck, and tractor around the world today has safety features first designed by Johan Hultin. Johan not only went to Alaska to find the 1915 flu virus, he went to Mount Everest to study how extreme altitudes impact the human body. He went to Turkey to visit the site where man first domesticated wheat and where agriculture was born.
Whenever Johan would talk to you, he was one of the best listeners.
Yeah, my dad would walk into a room and people would he'd light the room up.
He always talked about how important our brains are, obviously in our head and carrying the brain. And he would always say, the body is, well, in his accent, which of course I can't do, but the body is just to transport this. Yeah. And he would, hold onto his head.
I think one thing that maybe hasn't come out is the sense of empowerment that he gave me as a woman. I never got the sense that I was, a girl, so I couldn't do anything.
He made you feel you were the most important person when he was talking to you. It was very one-on-one.
It's now about 10:30, 10:45 at night, still light, but twilight, with a mist on the lake. And Johan said, let's go for a row. And I felt this was the most unusual, unexpected development. I said, okay, but it's a bit late. And he said, well, it's the longest day of the year. It's special for me to be here in Sweden on the longest day of the year. Very important for a Swede. So we go out into the lake and I am bailing furiously because the water was coming in very fast, much faster than I'd expected. And he leaned over when we got into the middle of this lake and said, hand me the can, which I did, thinking he's being very gentlemanly and he's going to bail for a little while to give me a break. And instead, he put the can down and leaned forward and said, Eileen, I have a question to ask. And if I don't get the answer I'm expecting and hoping for, we are going to have to swim back. The water, meanwhile, is rising up in this rowboat. And I said, what is it? And he said, well, will you marry me? And of course, the answer I gave him was not what he expected. He said, of course I will, you idiot, give me the can. So he handed me the can, but well, he didn't. He actually stood up and waded through this ankle deep water to give me a kiss. I gave him a peck on the cheek and said, go sit down quickly and give me the can. And I bailed ever more frantically and we came back to shore safely, but it was a very unexpected proposal and certainly a memorable one.
The waiter came, opened the wine and gave him the cork. But he had brought in a fake cork made of marzipan. When the waiter handed him the cork, instead of sniffing it, he palmed that and he took the marzipan thing and he smelled it. Goes, that's good. And then he took a bite of it and he was chewing on it. That's fine. Thank you.
And in appreciation to the Eskimo village that allowed him in, Dr. Hultin rebuilt the decaying crosses and adorned them with a special plaque to honor the 1918 victims who may one day help save millions of lives.
It was a great privilege to have been able to participate.
Whether Johan Hultin was climbing a mountain or carving a door, teaching about viruses, or having tea with Eileen, Johan taught us by example that life is to be lived to the fullest. With curiosity, with kindness, with joy, with family, and with limitless enthusiasm.
Hi, family and friends. Good to plug in? All right, working. So it's my pleasure to be up here in front of you guys and play a song. Well, I am the nephew by marriage of Johan Hultin. And I'm wearing his shirt right now. I'm not that much of a hippie. It's a little bit, but this is bringing out the hippie in me. And he picked it up on one of his travels somewhere, possibly Turkey. Maybe Eileen can confirm where this shirt came from. Any idea? No? Peter, no idea? Somewhere on his travels, many, many years ago, so I'm wearing it. My uncle married my mother's older sister and moved to America, so he is by and large the reason why my entirely Swedish family is in America, so therefore altering the courses of all of our lives. And wouldn't you agree with that? I mean, he came out here first, and married, you know, my sister's, sorry, my mother's older sister, and she followed her out here with my father. And so he's the reason why we're in the Bay Area. I'm very lucky for all of that, and think about that quite a lot. And actually the evening before he passed, I was telling someone that right around the time he passed away, which is a very strange coincidence. I'm going to play a song by David Bowie, one of Eileen's fellow countrymen. It's called Space Oddity. And it's about an astronaut that loses contact with Earth. And astronauts are scientists, so I find this song kind of befitting for the occasion. He's floating away into, after he walks through the airlock, and Earth is talking to the astronaut, and he's telling them, describing what the Earth looks like. Planet Earth is very blue. There's nothing I can do, if you guys know the lyrics. He loses contact and he floats away into the blackness. So a couple interesting facts about this song. David Bowie released this song just weeks before the Apollo 11 mission, we landed on the moon. The BBC in England used this song when they broadcasted and televised the landing on the moon, and this was like the official soundtrack of it. Kind of gave David Bowie a little bit of a nudge there. But I don't know if Eileen will remember that. You may recall that moment from there. So there is a countdown on verse 2 when it starts. Peter's going to help me, where it's, as the space shuttle's launching 10, 9, 8, right? And it's on the second verse. I'd appreciate it if you guys count down from 10 with me on the beat. It's fairly obvious how it goes. And you can follow Peter's cue. It's about a minute into the song. Last thing I'll say is there's a lyric in the song where he says, "Take your protein pills and put your helmets on." I'm going to change the lyric to "Take your fish oil pills and put your helmets on." So hopefully I won't mess it up because I learned this song a few days ago. Give me just a second here. Feel free to sing along.
Ground control to Major Tom. Ground control to Major Tom. Take your fish oil pills and put your helmet on. Ground control to Major Tom. Commencing countdown, engines on. Check ignition and may God's love be with you. This is ground control to Major Tom. You really made the grade. And the papers want to know who shot you where. Now it's time to leave the capsule if you dare. This is Major Tom to ground control. I'm stepping through the door. And I'm floating in the most peculiar ways. And the stars look very different today. For here I'm spitting in a tin can. There's nothing I can do. Still, and I think my spaceship knows which way to go. Tell my wife I love her very much, she knows. Ground control to Major Tom, your socket's dead, there's something wrong. Can you hear me, Major Tom? Can you hear me, Major Tom? Can you hear me, Major Tom? Can you hear? I'm sitting in a tin can. Above the moon.
Is the microphone still on? Thank you, everybody. That does conclude our program this afternoon. I want to thank you all for coming, especially since we've had this COVID problem. A lot of people are still afraid being indoors. So I truly appreciate your, making this big commitment and coming. Johan would be very, very honored to have you here. Thank you.